A police officer confronted a pregnant woman in a wheelchair, unaware of her husband's identity. The unexpected twist that followed left everyone stunned. Want to know how it all ended? Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun hung high, casting a golden glow over the bustling adventure park. The air buzzed with children's laughter, thrilled screams from the roller coasters, and the cheerful tunes of carnival music. It was a perfect summer day, filled with joy and excitement. In the middle of this lively scene, Angela navigated her wheelchair through the wide paths of the park, her hands steady on the wheels as she made her way towards the entrance. Angela, a woman in her late 30s, was in the final stages of a challenging pregnancy, one that required her to use a wheelchair for the past few months. She had grown accustomed to managing her mobility with grace despite the difficulties. Today was meant to be a memorable day. Her husband, Marcus, a federal agent, had promised to meet her and their young son, Noah, at the park later, once he finished some urgent business. Eager to give Noah an early start to enjoy the games and rides, Angela decided to go ahead with him to the park. As they approached the area reserved for visitors with disabilities, Angela felt a surge of determination. She wanted to give Noah a magical day, even if it meant pushing through her own exhaustion. Noah, brimming with excitement, walked beside her, occasionally running ahead and circling back, his bright eyes shining with joy. Angela couldn't help but smile. Her son's enthusiasm was contagious. "Mom, can we go on the giant Ferris wheel first?" Noah asked eagerly, tugging at her sleeve. "Of course, sweetheart," Angela replied with a laugh. "But first, we need to get a special pass." She steered her wheelchair towards a quieter side path leading to the accessible entrance, grateful for the trees lining the path that provided some much-needed shade. When they arrived at the entrance to the designated area, Angela noticed a security guard stationed by the gate. He was a middle-aged man with a solid build, his arms crossed and gaze fixed on her in a way that felt unsettling. There was something in his suspicious, almost dismissive stare that made Angela uneasy. Undeterred, she pushed forward, keeping her tone polite as she addressed him. "Hello, we're here to access the ride area," Angela said, holding a folder with her medical documents at the ready. "Access to the ride area? I have my documents here if you'd like to see them," Angela said, holding out a folder with her medical papers. The guard didn't acknowledge her politely worded request. Instead, he looked down at her in her wheelchair, then at Noah, before giving a slight shake of his head. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked in a gruff, unfriendly tone. "This area is for people who actually need it." Angela's smile faded as the weight of his words sank in. She took a slow, calming breath, reminding herself to stay composed. "I do need it," she replied, lifting the folder to emphasize her point. "I'm pregnant and using a wheelchair due to complications." The guard barely glanced at the folder before narrowing his eyes. "You don't look like you need it that badly," he scoffed. "You'd be surprised what some folks will do to take advantage of the system," he muttered, his tone laced with cynicism. The dismissal stung, and sensing his mother's discomfort, Noah moved closer, gripping the handle of her wheelchair tightly. Angela held the folder firmly, feeling frustration and anxiety mix in her chest. She glanced down at Noah, then looked back at the guard, her voice steady and controlled. "I understand your concerns," she said, carefully keeping her tone respectful. "But I'm not trying to take advantage of anything. I have a right to use this entrance, and I can show you my medical documents if you need to verify." Rather than softening, the guard's expression grew colder. He stepped forward, looking down at her with a sneer. "You know, some people think they can get whatever they want just because they say they have a problem," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "But we have to make sure the ones who really need it get it." Angela felt her patience wearing thin. But she didn't want to make a scene, especially not in front of Noah. She opened the folder, carefully showing him the medical documents again. "Here are my papers," she said, extending them toward him. "You can see for yourself." He barely glanced at the documents before shaking his head dismissively. "That's not good enough. Anyone can get a doctor to sign off on something," he muttered. "I need more than just some papers." Angela's heart sank, the sting of his words hitting deeper than the mere rejection. It wasn't just that he wouldn't allow her through, it was the way he spoke to her, as if she were trying to deceive him, as if she didn't belong there. She could feel the tension mounting, and a few passers-by had begun to slow down, curious about the interaction. Glancing around, Angela noticed the onlookers' glances, hearing the faint murmurs as people began turning their attention toward the scene unfolding between her and the guard. Angela's chest tightened, with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Please," she said, her voice strained as she struggled to keep calm. "I'm not trying to cause any problems, I just want to spend the day here with my son." But the guard shook his head firmly, already reaching for his radio. "I think I'm going to have to call this in," he said, his tone resolute. "We've had too many people trying to cheat the system lately. Better safe than sorry." Angela's pulse quickened as the guard spoke into his radio, requesting assistance. Her mind raced as she tried to think of any way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further out of control. She glanced down at Noah, who was clinging even tighter to the side of her wheelchair, his small face clouded with worry. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" he whispered. Angela mustered a reassuring smile for her son, despite her own mounting anxiety. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're just sorting something out," she said softly, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. But as the guard continued speaking into his radio, Angela felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over her. She had shown her documents, explained her situation, yet none of it seemed to matter. It was as if the guard had already made up his mind to view her with suspicion, and nothing she could say would change that. She could feel the judgmental gazes of passers-by, hear their low murmurs as they watched her every move. A response crackled over the guard's radio, confirming that a police officer would be there shortly. Angela's heart sank further. She had hoped to avoid any involvement with the authorities, knowing how unpredictable these encounters could sometimes be. The thought of Noah witnessing a scene like that made her stomach twist. But now, it seemed she had no other choice. The guard clipped his radio back onto his belt, crossing his arms and looking down at her with the same unyielding expression. "You can wait right here until the officer arrives," he said, his voice cold and final. "We'll get this sorted out." Angela gripped the wheels of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she fought to maintain her composure. This was supposed to be a day of joy, an escape from her everyday stresses. But now she found herself at the center of a confrontation she hadn't expected, and one she wasn't sure how to navigate. The sounds of the amusement park faded into the background, leaving only a tense silence hanging in the air as she and Noah waited by the entrance. Every passing second felt like an eternity, as Angela braced herself for whatever would come next. A heavy unease settled in Angela's chest. Noah stood close, glancing nervously around, and she reached out, touching his arm in an attempt to convey calmness she didn't truly feel. Her mind raced with dread about what might happen next. In the distance, the flashing lights of a police cruiser became visible, drawing murmurs from the crowd, now turning their attention toward the approaching vehicle. The car pulled up to the curb, and a broad-shouldered officer with a square jaw and an impatient expression stepped out. His name tag read T. Johnson. He walked toward Angela with a look that shifted from indifference to something approaching disdain. The security guard quickly approached the officer, explaining the situation in a low voice. Angela couldn't make out his exact words, but the skeptical tone was unmistakable. As Officer Johnson's eyes settled on her, he shook his head slightly, as though he had already reached a judgment. "Ma'am," he began, his voice dripping with authority, "I've been informed there's an issue here. You're using a wheelchair to access this area, but there's some concern about whether you really need it." Angela's jaw tightened. The skepticism in his voice was evident, and she took a deep breath to steady herself before responding. "I've shown the guard my medical documents," she said, holding up her folder again. "I'm pregnant and experiencing complications that make it difficult for me to walk. That's why I need the wheelchair." But Officer Johnson's expression remained unmoved. He glanced down at her documents and then back at her with a dismissive raised eyebrow. "Anyone can get a doctor's note," he said coolly. "You'll need more than that to prove you need this." Encouraged by the officer's presence, the security guard chimed in, raising his voice for onlookers to hear. "I told her already. We've had too many people trying to cheat the system. You wouldn't believe what folks will do to get special treatment." Angela felt a flare of anger rise within her. It wasn't only the fact that they were questioning her honesty, it was the condescension, the way they seemed to view her as inherently suspect, as though her words and documents meant nothing. She felt that this wasn't just about her wheelchair, it was also about her being a black woman in this setting, and that realization stung even more deeply. Her voice trembled slightly, though she kept it steady. "I'm not trying to cheat anyone," she said firmly. "I'm here with my son to enjoy the park, and I have every right to be here." "And I have every right to be here," Angela asserted, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside. But Officer Johnson's gaze only grew colder. "If that's true, then why don't you stand up and show me you really need that chair?" he challenged, his voice edged with impatience. "If you're truly unable to walk, proving it shouldn't be hard." The demand hit Angela like a slap. She felt a wave of humiliation and anger flood her chest. It wasn't just a question of her honesty, he was treating her as if she were a criminal, demanding proof as if she were on trial. She took a breath, gritting her teeth to steady herself. "I can't stand up," she replied, her voice low and firm. "I told you. I have complications that make it dangerous for me to walk." The officer stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "Well, I'm starting to think you're just trying to cause a scene, and if you don't cooperate, you could be charged with obstructing an investigation." Angela's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair tightly, her knuckles turning white. Every word she spoke felt twisted, as if no matter how reasonably she explained, it only made her look more suspicious. Her pulse raced, heat rising in her face as she struggled to stay calm. "I'm not obstructing anything," she said, frustration breaking through her controlled tone. "I'm just trying to explain." But Officer Johnson cut her off sharply. "Enough with the excuses. Now, either get up and prove you need that chair, or I'll have to escort you out." His hand moved toward the cuffs on his belt, and a few people in the crowd gasped audibly. Just then, Noah's small, fearful voice broke through the tense air. "Mommy, what's happening? Are they going to take you away?" He looked up at her, his wide eyes brimming with tears. The sound of her son's voice snapped Angela back. She turned to Noah, gently stroking his hair as she tried to reassure him, though her own fear was growing. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The officer's eyes flicked down to Noah, his expression hardening even further. "And who's this?" he asked. "Is he involved in whatever is going on here?" Angela's protective instinct flared instantly. "Leave him out of this," she said sharply, her gaze fierce. "He's just a child." But Officer Johnson's expression remained stony. "If you don't comply, we may have to take steps to ensure both your safety and his." His words hung heavily in the air, the implication unmistakable. That could mean taking him into custody until this is sorted out. The threat landed like a heavy weight, pressing down on Angela's chest. Now, it wasn't just her safety at stake, they were threatening her son too. The sheer audacity and cruelty of it filled her with a sense of helplessness. But beneath that helplessness, a new resolve began to grow. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was an outright assault on her rights, her dignity, and now her family. She could feel the anger and determination building within her, ready to confront whatever came next. Angela couldn't let them do this, to her, or to Noah. Taking a shaky breath, she looked Officer Johnson squarely in the eyes. "You're treating me like a criminal," she said, her voice trembling, but gradually growing stronger. "All I've done is try to use the accessible entrance, which I have every right to do. I've provided my documents. I've explained my situation. There's no reason for you to treat me like this." But the officer only sneered, his hand still hovering near his cuffs. "Like I said, I don't believe you," he replied coldly, "and if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to take you in." By now, the crowd around them had grown substantially, and murmurs of disapproval began to ripple through the onlookers. Several people raised their phones to record, capturing the scene as a few voices called out in support. "Leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong," one voice shouted. "This is discrimination," another yelled. For a moment, Angela thought the officer might back down in the face of public scrutiny, but instead, he seemed only to grow bolder. "You people need to mind your own business," he barked at the crowd. "We're handling a situation here." With a quick, rough movement, he reached down and gripped the handle of Angela's wheelchair, yanking it backward. The sudden jolt made her gasp in pain, her hands gripping the arms of the chair to keep from toppling. Noah cried out in terror, clutching her leg as though he could protect her. The world seemed to spin around Angela as she tried to steady herself, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She looked up at the officer, her gaze filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. She couldn't let them do this to her, not here and not in front of her child. But when she tried to speak, her voice faltered, and all that came out was a choked whisper. Just then, the sound of a car door slamming shut cut through the commotion. Angela turned her head to see a familiar figure striding purposefully toward them. It was her husband, Marcus, moving with urgency, his face a mask of controlled fury. Relief and apprehension surged through Angela as he approached, the situation teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Marcus moved swiftly, his gaze fixed on the scene ahead. From across the park, he had spotted the crowd gathering and heard the raised voices. When he saw Angela's wheelchair surrounded by police, a wave of alarm had crashed through him. Now, as he neared, his heart pounded fiercely. A mix of anger and fear blazed within Marcus as he took in the look on Angela's face, a combination of helplessness and defiance. It only fueled the fire in him. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice slicing through the murmuring crowd. "What do you think you're doing? That's my wife!" Officer Johnson, still gripping Angela's wheelchair, turned to face him, his expression hardening as though expecting this confrontation. He let go of the chair, straightening up to meet Marcus's gaze. "Sir, I need you to stay back," Johnson said, his tone heavy with authority and condescension. "We're handling a situation here." Marcus didn't slow his approach, his eyes shifting between the officer and Angela, who was clutching the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were white. Beside her, Noah stood with tear-streaked cheeks, clinging to her leg in fear. The sight of his distressed family made Marcus's anger flare even hotter. "What situation?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and tense. "You're harassing my wife and scaring my son. She hasn't done anything wrong." Officer Johnson's jaw clenched. "Your wife was unable to provide sufficient proof to use the accessible entrance," he said coldly, glancing dismissively at Angela as though she were a misbehaving child. "And she refused to comply with my instructions." Marcus's temper boiled over. "She showed you her medical documents, didn't she?" he shot back. "She has every right to be here, just like anyone else." Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Sir, you need to calm down," he warned, his hand moving closer to the radio on his shoulder. "You're interfering with an active investigation." "Investigation?" Marcus scoffed. "This isn't an investigation. This is you abusing your authority." The crowd, which had swelled significantly, began to murmur more loudly, the air thick with a mixture of concern, curiosity, and anger. More people raised their phones to record the scene, capturing each word and movement. Johnson's partner, a younger officer with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Sir, if you don't step back immediately, we'll be forced to detain you for obstruction. This is your final warning." Marcus took a step closer to Angela, positioning himself protectively between her and the officers. "You're not detaining anyone," he said in a low, icy tone. "You're the ones who need to back off." Officer Johnson's patience had worn thin, and his face contorted in frustration as he squared up to Marcus, the tension reaching a breaking point. Johnson nodded to his partner, who reached for the handcuffs at his belt. "If that's how you want to play it," Johnson sneered, "then you're both coming with us." Angela's breath caught, her face stricken with panic. "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. He's just trying to protect us." The officers ignored her, and Johnson advanced on Marcus with a cold determination, his partner close behind. Marcus braced himself, his fists clenched at his sides as the officers closed in. Before he could react, Johnson's partner stepped forward and shoved him hard in the chest, sending him stumbling back. He quickly regained his footing, his expression hardening with fury. The crowd gasped in shock, and several people called out, urging the officers to stop. Noah, still clinging to Angela's leg, began to sob uncontrollably. "Daddy, don't let them take you," he cried, his small voice cracking with fear. Angela's heart pounded as she watched in horror, feeling as if the entire world was spinning out of control. With desperation, she shouted, "Leave us alone, we haven't done anything wrong." Johnson's partner seized Marcus by the arm, roughly yanking it behind his back as he reached for the cuffs. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting an officer," he said. Marcus struggled against the officer's hold, his face twisted with anger. "Let go of me," he shouted. "You have no right to do this." The officer twisted Marcus's arm higher, sending a sharp pain shooting through his shoulder, and he grimaced. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit him like a blow. He was a federal agent, being manhandled by officers who had no idea who they were dealing with. Yet he knew that revealing his identity now, in this charged atmosphere, would likely only inflame things further. He had to find another way to de-escalate this. "Look at my wife," Marcus shouted, his voice thick with urgency. "She's pregnant and in a wheelchair. Is this how you treat people who need help?" For a brief moment, the younger officer hesitated, glancing toward Angela, who sat hunched in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face. But Johnson's harsh command broke through his partner's hesitation. "Cuff him and get him in the car," Johnson snapped. "We'll deal with her next." The word next echoed ominously in Marcus's mind, like a threat. His heart clenched as his eyes darted to Angela and Noah, both trembling in fear. He knew he couldn't let this go any further. Just as the younger officer was about to tighten the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, a clear, firm voice rang out from the crowd. "This is wrong. They haven't done anything to deserve this." The voice belonged to an older woman who had been watching everything unfold, her expression indignant. She stepped forward, raising her phone high. "I've been recording the whole time," she announced, her voice steady and resolute. "And I'm not the only one. We all saw what you did." Several other onlookers joined in, their voices rising, demanding that the officers stop. The air was thick with tension, teetering on the edge of chaos. Johnson shot a sharp glare at the crowd, but the pressure from onlookers was too intense to ignore. Sensing an opportunity, Angela gathered her strength and found her voice again. "Please, just listen to us," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "You don't have to do this." But Johnson, eyes hard with determination, took a step closer to her. "Ma'am," he said coldly, "you are obstructing an investigation and refusing to comply with lawful orders. We're going to have to take you in as well." Angela felt the words hit her like a punch to the gut. "No," she cried, her hands trembling as they gripped her wheelchair's armrests. "I can't go anywhere. I'm pregnant, and I need medical care." For the first time, Johnson's partner looked uncertain, glancing back at the crowd, which was now chanting for the officers to stop. Several people were holding up their phones, capturing every second of the encounter. The pressure was mounting, and even Johnson seemed to realize the situation was spiraling out of control. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Ma'am, this is your last chance," he warned, his voice steely. "Either you cooperate, or we'll have to use force." Marcus's mind raced as he felt the cuffs hanging loosely from his wrists. He had to act fast. With a final burst of strength, he twisted his body, breaking free from the younger officer's grip. Before Johnson could react, Marcus stepped forward and shouted, "Enough!" The word echoed through the air, seeming to stop time. The crowd fell silent and all eyes turned to him. With calm authority, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his FBI badge, holding it high for everyone to see. "I am a federal agent," he declared, his voice ringing out clearly, "and you are violating my family's rights." The crowd gasped as the badge glinted in the sunlight, and Johnson's face went pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. He took a step back, his confidence shaken, as the balance of power shifted in that moment. The full weight of the situation finally sank in, as Marcus held his badge high, a challenge to the officer's authority. The younger officer froze, his hand hovering over the cuffs, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of support, their energy shifting the balance of power and pressing down on the officers. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. How things unfolded next would determine whether justice or further chaos would reign. His declaration, The badge, held high like a symbol of defiance, rang out over the crowd. For a moment, it seemed the tide had turned. But as Marcus met Officer Johnson's glare, he saw shock turning to fury in the officer's eyes. Johnson's face flushed with anger as he processed Marcus's revelation. Gritting his teeth, he sneered, "I don't care who you are," pointing a finger at Marcus. "You're obstructing police work, and that badge doesn't give you a free pass to interfere. Stand down now, or we'll charge you with resisting arrest." Marcus's jaw tightened as a new wave of anger rose within him. "You don't seem to understand what's happening here," he retorted, his voice firm and controlled. "You're violating our rights, and I'm telling you to stop. This isn't about resisting arrest, it's about protecting my family from being mistreated." The younger officer, visibly shaken, glanced nervously between Marcus and the crowd. Taking a cautious step back, he leaned toward Johnson. "Sir, maybe we should let this go," he murmured, his voice barely audible amid the murmurs of the crowd. But Johnson's pride was already bruised, and he had no intention of backing down, not with his authority being questioned so openly. Turning sharply to his partner, he barked, "No, we're not letting this go. We're going to do our job." Without waiting for a response, Johnson took a step toward Angela, who was gripping the armrests of her wheelchair, her face pale with fear. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for obstructing a police investigation," he said, his voice cold. "You need to come with us now." Angela's breath hitched, panic flashing across her face as she clutched the armrests tighter. She was trapped, vulnerable, and Marcus felt a wave of dread as he watched, realizing the officers were pushing this further than he had thought possible. The absurdity of it all hit Angela like a blow. She was a pregnant woman in a wheelchair, facing arrest for simply trying to use the accessible entrance. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I've shown you my documents. I just want to take my son to enjoy the park." But Johnson remained unmoved, his hand reaching for the cuffs on his belt. The crowd erupted in a fresh wave of outrage, shouting for the officers to stop. "You can explain that to the judge," Johnson said dismissively, as though her words meant nothing to him. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched the officer approach Angela, cuffs in hand. He couldn't allow them to take her away, not like this, not in front of Noah. "You're making a huge mistake," Marcus warned, his voice low and threatening. "If you arrest her, you'll be facing more than a complaint. You'll be facing federal charges," Johnson sneered, unfazed. "Are you threatening a police officer?" he taunted. "I suggest you step back before you make things worse for yourself." The tension in the air grew suffocating, and several members of the crowd began shouting, their voices angry and disbelieving. A few even took steps closer, as if ready to intervene. Noah, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up in a small, trembling voice. "Mommy, don't let them take you," he whimpered, clinging to her leg, his tear-streaked face twisted in fear. The sight of her son's terror tore at Angela's heart. She swallowed hard, reaching down with a shaking hand to stroke his head. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her own voice was filled with dread. "I'm not going anywhere." But Johnson was done listening. He moved behind Angela, gripping the handles of her wheelchair. "You're coming with us," he said, his tone cold and final. Without waiting for a response, he began pulling the chair backward. Angela cried out in pain, clutching her belly as a sharp spasm shot through her. Her body jerked involuntarily, and she let out a gasp that seemed to silence the crowd. The suddenness of her reaction made Johnson hesitate, though his expression remained stony. "Let's not make this more difficult than it has to be," he growled, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Marcus's mind raced as he saw Angela's face contort in pain. He knew he had to do something, quickly. Marcus knew he had to act immediately. He stepped forward, raising his voice above the crowd. "She's in pain," he shouted. "She needs medical attention, not handcuffs." The crowd roared with renewed outrage. "You're gonna hurt her," someone yelled. "She's pregnant." "What's wrong with you?" shouted another. Thompson's grip on Angela's wheelchair tightened, his jaw clenching as he saw the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones out, recording his every move, their faces twisted in anger and disgust. He was rapidly losing control of the situation. The younger officer, visibly shaken, placed a hand on Thompson's shoulder. "We need to stop," he urged, his voice trembling. "This is getting out of hand." For a moment, Thompson's resolve wavered, but his stubborn pride won out. "No," he said through gritted teeth, "we're doing this by the book." He looked down at Angela, who was clutching her stomach, her breaths short and rapid. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to use more force." Angela gasped for air, fighting through the pain in her abdomen. The thought of being forcibly taken away in this condition filled her with terror. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes pleading silently for help. Marcus's mind raced. He realized that words alone wouldn't diffuse the situation. These officers were too determined to assert their authority, and the crowd was too close to erupting. He needed to take decisive action to shift the momentum. With a burst of resolve, Marcus raised his badge once more and took a firm step toward the officers. "I'm ordering you to stand down," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "This woman is my wife, and she is in medical distress. By continuing to detain her, you're violating federal law." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Thompson hesitated. The weight of Marcus's words, the power of the badge, and the watchful eyes of the crowd pressing down on him. But instead of relenting, he sneered, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "You think you're above the law because you're with the FBI?" he spat. "Out here, we make the rules." Marcus felt his blood boil at the arrogance and cruelty in Thompson's tone. "And I'll make sure you answer for breaking them," he shot back, his voice cold and resolute. In a flash of frustration, Johnson yanked on Angela's wheelchair, jerking it backward. Angela cried out in pain, clutching the armrests to keep from falling. The brutal action became a tipping point for the crowd. The simmering anger transformed into determination to intervene. Several people stepped forward, closing in on the officer. "You're gonna hurt her. Stop!" a woman shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "We're not gonna let you do this." A man in his 40s moved closer to Marcus. "Let us help," he urged. "You're right, we can't let them get away with this." Others in the crowd echoed his sentiment, their voices rising in support and condemnation of the officer's actions. Realizing he was losing control, Johnson took a step back and reached for his radio. "We need more units here," he barked, his tone urgent. "The situation is escalating." The younger officer's expression wavered between doubt and fear as he glanced at Johnson. "Maybe we should back off," he murmured, barely audible. "It's not worth it." Johnson's face darkened, but before he could respond, Marcus took advantage of the moment. He stepped forward, seizing the handles of Angela's wheelchair. "Get your hands off her," he said, his voice as cold as steel. The two men locked eyes, the tension between them sparking dangerously. It seemed as if things might erupt into violence at any second. But then, the wail of sirens broke through the air, signaling the arrival of additional officers. Marcus felt a surge of urgency. This was his last chance to take control of the situation. He bent down to Angela, his voice low but intense. "I'm not going to let them take you," he said. "We'll fight this together, no matter what it takes." Angela nodded, tears mingling with sweat as she looked up at him. "I know," she whispered, a hint of hope in her voice. "We won't let them win." As the additional squad cars pulled up, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The sirens grew louder and the crowd surged forward, their voices a chaotic blend of anger, outrage, and concern. Angela gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white, while Marcus stood protectively in front of her, defiant and unyielding. He knew that this moment would determine everything: the safety of his family, his career, and the powerful message they were about to send. The squad cars screeched to a halt, and several officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and readiness. Leading them was a stern-faced sergeant with a commanding presence. He strode toward Officer Johnson, assessing the chaotic scene, his gaze shifting between Marcus, Angela, and the agitated crowd. "What's going on here, Johnson?" the sergeant demanded, his eyes narrowing. "We got a call for backup, but this doesn't look like a serious threat." Johnson, his face taut with frustration and bruised pride, jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction. "This man interfered with a lawful investigation," he snapped. "Now the crowd's getting out of control, and his wife is refusing to comply. They've been obstructing justice." The sergeant looked between Marcus and Angela, who sat hunched over in her wheelchair, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. His expression softened slightly, as if he were beginning to grasp the absurdity of the situation. "You're arresting a pregnant woman?" he asked, disbelief lacing his voice. "She's refusing to cooperate," Johnson shot back defensively. "And this guy," he added, gesturing toward Marcus, "claims he's with the FBI." The sergeant raised an eyebrow at that. He turned to Marcus, his tone skeptical yet more measured. "Is that true?" he asked. "Are you really with the Bureau?" Marcus's pulse quickened. He had already displayed his badge, but now he knew he had to make his authority crystal clear. Stepping forward, he held out his badge once more, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Yes, I'm an FBI agent," he stated firmly. "Marcus Hayes. And what's happening here is a gross violation of my wife's civil rights." The sergeant studied the badge, then looked at Marcus's face as if weighing his words. Meanwhile, Johnson's face darkened, his pride visibly stinging as the realization sank in that he may have overstepped his bounds. But instead of backing down, Johnson sneered and muttered, "Just because you flash a badge doesn't mean you get to break the law." Marcus felt anger surge in his chest, but he kept his tone controlled, his words laced with firmness. "I'm not the one breaking the law here. You are. You've threatened my pregnant wife with arrest, disregarded her medical documentation, and used force without any justification. Yanked her wheelchair and escalated this whole situation to the point of calling for backup, all because you decided to treat her as a criminal instead of a person who needs assistance," Marcus continued, his voice rising with each word. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and their support for Marcus and Angela became more vocal. Several people shouted in agreement, while others continued recording, their phones trained on the officers. The sergeant's expression shifted as he listened. He took a step back, giving Johnson a hard look. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You laid hands on her?" Johnson crossed his arms defiantly, his face rigid. "She was resisting," he insisted stubbornly. "We had to maintain control. The situation was getting out of hand, and she refused to comply with my instructions." "She wasn't resisting," Marcus cut in, his tone laced with anger. "She was in pain. Look at her. She's a pregnant woman in a wheelchair. What kind of threat could she possibly pose to you?" The sergeant's jaw tightened as he looked over at Angela, who sat breathing heavily, visibly strained by the confrontation. His expression softened, taking in her obvious vulnerability, before he turned back to Johnson, his eyes hardening. "This doesn't sound like a situation that required this level of force," he said coldly. "You should have exercised more discretion." Johnson's face flushed, but before he could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his voice stronger and filled with righteous indignation. "This is exactly why people don't trust the police," he said, addressing not just Johnson but the surrounding officers as well. "When those who are supposed to protect and serve act with this kind of arrogance and disregard for the public's rights, it tears apart the very fabric of our society." His words struck a chord. Not only did the crowd respond with nods and shouts of agreement, but even some of the officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. The tension in the air thickened, yet something seemed to crack within the officers' unified front. But Johnson, too deep in his pride, refused to back down. He took a step toward Marcus, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "You think you can just come here, flash your badge, and act like you're above the law?" he sneered. "Just because you work for the feds doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want." Marcus's patience finally broke. He took a deep breath, locking eyes with Johnson. "This isn't about me being above the law," he said, his voice deadly calm. "It's about you abusing your authority." Marcus's voice remained deadly calm. "This is about you abusing your power," he said firmly. "If you don't de-escalate this situation right now, I'll make sure there are consequences for you and everyone involved in this abuse." The sergeant quickly stepped between them, raising a hand as if to physically separate the two men. "Enough," he said, his tone firm. "We're not going to continue this here, in front of the entire park." He turned to Johnson, his face a mix of anger and frustration. "Stand down," he ordered. "We're not arresting her, and we're certainly not arresting him. This situation has gone far enough." Johnson looked as though he wanted to argue, but the sergeant's tone left no room for debate. He turned back to Angela and Marcus, his expression still hard but no longer openly hostile. "We'll let you go," he said gruffly. "But this isn't over. I'll be filing a report on this incident." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady and unyielding as he looked at Johnson. "You do that," he replied evenly, "and I'll be filing a report of my own. I'll make sure this goes up the chain." Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, the tension easing as people realized the immediate threat of arrest had passed. Angela slumped back in her wheelchair, a wave of relief and exhaustion washing over her all at once. Marcus knelt beside her, reaching out to take her hand, his grip warm and steady. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're going to fight this." Angela nodded, squeezing his hand in return. She knew this was only the beginning, a battle not just for her own dignity, but for justice and accountability for the countless others who had been mistreated and silenced. As the officers retreated and the sergeant led Johnson away, Marcus stood up, turning to address the crowd. His voice carried with determination and defiance. "We're not going to let this be swept under the rug," he declared. "We're going to make sure this kind of abuse stops." The crowd responded with cheers and applause, a powerful wave of solidarity and support that washed over Marcus and Angela. They had stood up against injustice, and now they would press on, not as victims, but as advocates for change. As they prepared to leave the park, Marcus gently helped Angela into the car, securing her seatbelt with care. He looked into her eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, standing strong together in the face of adversity. "We'll make them answer for this," he promised, his voice resolute. Angela gave him a weary but determined smile. "We will," she whispered. "For us, for Noah, and for everyone else. This," Marcus promised firmly, "for you, for Noah, and for every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter." Angela gave him a tired but resolute smile. "We will," she said softly. "We have to." As the sound of sirens faded into the distance, Marcus started the car and drove away from the park, the weight of the day hanging heavy in the air. But as they left the site of the confrontation, they knew this fight was only beginning. In the days that followed, their encounter with Officer Johnson spread across social media like wildfire. Videos recorded by bystanders replayed thousands of times on news outlets and online platforms, with headlines like "FBI Agent Confronts Local Police Over Treatment of Pregnant Wife" and "Amusement Park Incident Sparks Outrage Over Police Conduct." Their personal struggle had transformed into a national conversation. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, his phone constantly buzzing with calls and messages. He had already contacted a lawyer, an old friend who specialized in civil rights cases, and they were preparing to file formal complaints against Officer Johnson and the local police department. Marcus's fingers tapped restlessly on the table, his mind racing with the events of the past days and the long road ahead. Across from him, Angela sat with her hands resting on her belly. Though the physical pain had begun to ease, the emotional toll still weighed heavily. She found herself replaying the officer's sneer, the humiliation she'd felt, and the fear in Noah's voice. Each time, a pang of hurt cut through her. But beneath the pain, a new resolve was growing. She wasn't going to let this become just another story, forgotten by the next news cycle. "Do you think they'll actually do something?" she asked quietly, a hint of hope in her voice. "The police department, I mean. Do you think they'll hold him accountable?" Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze. He knew that change was never guaranteed, that the system often had ways of protecting its own. But this time, they had the public's attention, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. "We don't have a choice," he replied, his tone firm. "Too many people saw what happened, too many witnesses. We have to make them act." As if on cue, his phone buzzed again with a new message, this time from a local civil rights organization, reaching out in support of their case. The civil rights organization that had taken interest in their case was organizing a rally in support of Angela, calling for greater accountability and reform within the police department. They invited Marcus to speak, asking him to share their story and keep the momentum for change alive. Angela reached out and placed her hand over his. "We should do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she still carried. "If it helps prevent this from happening to someone else, then it's worth it." Marcus squeezed her hand gently, feeling a surge of pride at her strength. He nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "We'll do it," he agreed, "and we'll make sure they listen." The day of the rally dawned with clear skies and a chill in the air, hinting at autumn's approach. Marcus and Angela stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out over a sea of faces. Hundreds had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Angela," "End police brutality," and "We stand with you." The crowd was diverse, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds united by a common cause. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Angela beside him. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, and he stepped up to the microphone. As he adjusted it, a hush fell over the crowd, everyone focused entirely on him. "My name is Marcus Hayes," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I'm an FBI agent, a husband, and a father. And 2 weeks ago, my wife and son experienced something that no family should ever have to go through." He paused, memories of that day flashing through his mind. The anger in Officer Johnson's voice, the fear in Angela's eyes, the helplessness he felt as he tried to protect his family. He channeled these emotions into his words, letting them infuse his speech with urgency. "We went to that park looking for a day of joy," he continued. "A day to make my son smile, and to give my wife a chance to relax. But instead, we found ourselves facing the kind of injustice that too many people in our country face every day. We were treated like criminals, like we didn't matter, all because of the biases and prejudices that are still too prevalent in our society." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Marcus saw people nodding in support. His voice grew stronger as he pressed on. "This isn't just about what happened to us," he said. "It's about every person who's been mistreated because of the color of their skin, their circumstances, or simply because they dared to ask for fair treatment. It's about the abuse of power, about a system that needs to change. And we're here today because we're not going to be silent anymore," Marcus declared, and the crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in solidarity. Angela, standing beside him, reached for his hand and gave it a squeeze. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel hope. Hope that maybe, together, they could turn their pain into something meaningful. After his speech, other speakers took the stage: activists, community leaders, and even a few other victims of police misconduct. Each story added weight to the demand for accountability, painting a powerful picture of a community united in their call for change. As the rally concluded, Marcus and Angela returned home, exhausted but uplifted by the support they'd received. But the battle was far from over. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and well-wishers, each conversation a reminder of the stakes of their fight. The following week, the police department announced that Officer Johnson had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. It was a small victory, but for Marcus and Angela, it was only the beginning. They moved forward with their lawsuit, determined to hold Johnson and the department accountable, not just for their own experience, but for every person who had faced similar abuses. Media attention continued to grow, and national news outlets picked up their story, shining a light on systemic issues in policing. Marcus spoke at more events, sharing their experience and calling for reforms. He knew that by stepping into the public eye, they were becoming targets for those resistant to change, but he also knew that keeping the pressure on was the only way forward. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus sat in the living room with Angela and Noah. The TV flickered in the corner, showing a news segment about the ongoing investigation. Noah was curled up on the couch, his head resting on Angela's lap as she stroked his hair gently. "Daddy, are they going to make that mean man go away?" Noah asked, his small voice full of the innocence of childhood. Marcus glanced at Angela, who gave him a soft nod. Leaning forward, he rested his elbows on his knees. "I don't know, buddy," he said honestly. "But we're going to do everything we can to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. And there are a lot of people who believe in that too." Noah thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I want to help too, when I grow up," he said, his voice steady. "So no one has to be scared." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her son, and she reached down to hug him tightly. "You're already helping, sweetie," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "Just by being here." Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he watched them, knowing that no matter how challenging the road ahead might be, they had something worth fighting for. Angela's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her son's words, and she hugged him tightly. "You're already helping, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Just by being here." Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he watched them, realizing that, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they had something worth fighting for. Something that made every challenge, every moment of fear worthwhile. Months later, the investigation concluded, and Officer Johnson faced a disciplinary hearing. Under public pressure and scrutiny, the department announced new training programs and a review of their practices. It wasn't the sweeping reform Marcus and Angela had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction, a sign that their efforts had made a difference. In the end, Johnson was stripped of his badge and faced charges for his actions at the park. His trial became a public spectacle, with testimonies from witnesses, video evidence, and the voices of those inspired by Marcus and Angela's courage. As the verdict was read, guilty of abuse of power and misconduct, Marcus squeezed Angela's hand, feeling a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was validation that their fight had been worth it. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered once more, this time in celebration. Marcus and Angela stood together, hands intertwined, looking out over the faces of those who had supported them. They knew there was still work to be done, but they also knew they had the strength to keep pushing forward. As they left the courthouse that day, with the sun shining down and the promise of justice ringing in their ears, Marcus and Angela walked away with a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced darkness and refused to be broken, and now they were ready to build a future where no one would have to face the same fear and pain they had endured. The fight for justice was just beginning, but they were prepared for whatever came next, side by side and never alone. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next powerful story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos for more inspiring moments. Your support means everything. Stay tuned for more content that matters.